Okay, now we're going to continue in section 3 about propaganda, and we're going to talk about groups, but more specifically classical groups going on the ambassador tours. And then we're going to end with what happened after, like the later history of these ambassadorships. All right, so we're going to talk about UNESCO really quickly. This is yet another group that's bringing these tours around the world. This is an agency through the United Nations. They develop universal respect for human rights and collaborate internationally. Ensembles that were touring under the auspices of the State Department. In other words, the State Department was hiring them. These guys were encouraged to perform, quote, American works. Now, if you guys remember from when we talked about section 4, the definition of what an American work is changed all the time, and it got to be kind of challenging to figure out what did they actually want us to be playing. One of the things that was okay was this military style music. Although the State Department oversaw the bulk of American musical gifts, there's an orchestra that's part of the United States 7th Army. They kind of like the Army Band. This was an orchestral ensemble, and they were in Europe during the Cold War for 10 years. They were occupying Germany. So this is a group of soldiers who are being stationed in Germany, and they have this orchestra that is pretty good, and people enjoy hearing their music. We also have individuals in addition to these groups. Individual composers, conductors, and lecturers traveled as well, sometimes under the American Specialists program, sometimes as Fulbright scholars. So all sorts of different organizations helping make this happen. The next thing I want to highlight, when cultural exchanges were established with the Soviet Union, we talk about this in section 4, Roy Harris traveled to the USSR with 3 other composers. He conducted his Symphony No. 5, which was our second listening example. Roy Harris is one of our conductors, one of our composers. This is the work that he had said was dedicated to the Soviet Union back when they were allies with the United States. And then he got in big trouble for that, going back and forth with those challenges. This is kind of an interesting fun fact. He was the first American to conduct his own music in the Soviet Union. So we're continuing to talk about music that was okay to play as these ambassadorships and overseas. And that brings us to our next listening selection, which is the Credendum. Over and over, you've heard me talk about collaborations and opportunities for people to write music where they could get paid for it. This is still happening, and one of those opportunities, this is an Americanist work request, and this is for UNESCO. UNESCO is asking for this work to be written. So they're paying him beforehand and saying, write us this Americanist work for an orchestra. This is interesting up here. In short, a commission, which was the UNESCO organization, was giving Schumann, this is Albert Schumann, a request for a composition. For a composer, this is extremely flattering because the invitation asks for a piece on faith. In other words, the government agency is saying, we've liked your previous work and we're sure you're going to do great for us. So please, here's some money, write some music, and we will take it on tour. A little bit more about Credendum. Schumann decided to title the piece Credendum, which means to believe. And the name of the whole work's subtitle is Article of Faith. Then there are 3 movements of Credendum. Remember from our talk about form, movements are kind of like the chapters of a book. They're smaller pieces of this work. So he has the declaration, and that's what our next listening example is, the chorale, and the finale. Dropping down, this was really popular, and they decided that they wanted to buy a lot of these records and send them overseas. They decided this was really, really good propaganda music in this, what they call this cultural offensive here, trying to make the United States look better in comparison with the Soviet Union. So all of these recordings go overseas. It's also performed live. Now we'll talk a little bit more about Credendum's details. So your composer here is William Schumann. In the first movement of Credendum, the horns, tubas, and trombones all play at fortissimo. So you've got brass instruments, brass wind instruments playing very, very, very loud. They have a distinctive two-note upward leap of a ninth. It's a motif, kind of like the Happy Birthday was a motif. This is a small motif as well that expands throughout the piece until it becomes a primary tune. This is another piece similar to Shostakovich's, where it's very, very loud. The whole dynamic from the entire piece rarely gets away from triple F, triple fortissimo. This is an interesting aside. The first movement, which is what we're going to listen to, is only written for winds and percussion, and then one string bass, which isn't all that odd of a thing to add into a wind group, a wind ensemble. Schumann said that that was the natural choice for this piece, or for this movement, and that strings would have spoiled it. Not exactly sure why, but strings would have been a little bit more smooth, perhaps. All right, other things you're going to notice. There's a section called meno mosso. Less motion is what that means literally. There's a sudden drop in the tempo. It gets much slower. It also gets much more quiet. They say this is a chance for you to catch your breath before moving on to the second movement. Credendum is what's called a cyclic composition, so that the different chapters have shared recurring materials. All right, we're going to play Credendum for you next. There's that two-note motif. There it is again. Except it's changed a little bit. There's that timpani that you hear. This is this, a fanfare sound on a unison E. Got a lot more smooth here. You can hear it in the trumpets. This is where we're at. That's a piano. It got quieter. Now it's getting louder and also faster. Now we're back in that fanfare. Unison. Hear that? This is where we're at now. comes that final crescendo. And here you can hear less motion. It's quieter. Dynamics are piano, which is quiet. All right, so that is Credendum. Now to talk about the late history of these diplomatic missions. Rock is really getting popular all around the world, but these organizations that are putting these diplomatic missions on, they are not a fan of rock and roll, and they don't like the idea that rock and roll would be representing the United States, even though it's so huge. They are not excited about including rock and roll in this propaganda war. In fact, if you guys remember Willis Conover from Voice of America, this is the guy who played the A-Train before his jazz section of Voice of America. He says, "I see no reason to poison the ears of overseas listeners." But they can't deny it forever, and times begin to change, and tastes begin to change. And the diplomats overseas are kind of saying to the State Department, you guys can't keep winning by just sending a woodwind quintet. It's not doing what we need. And so late during this period, Blood, Sweat, and Tears is a band that has been winning some Grammy Awards. And I'm going to put some Blood, Sweat, and Tears music out on our classroom page. You've probably heard some of their music. So they get sent, this is the first rock band to get sent for the State Department. They go to Yugoslavia, Romania, and Poland. A lot of people didn't like this. They simply did not like rock music. But there were also a lot of musicians at this time who are speaking out against the war in Vietnam. So we're at this point now in the Cold War where the Vietnam War is happening, and there's a lot of protest in the States about that. During this time, there are lots and lots of singers putting out protest music. That's the kind of music that the State Department is never, ever going to send overseas. That is anti-American music, in their opinion. Just to touch on this a little bit, these folk musicians and rock musicians were expressing anger about the Vietnam War, so those were not ever used. And that takes us to the end of section 3.